Welcome to Cryptid's Den. 70% of you watching haven't subscribed yet, so hit that red button to join me in uncovering spine-chilling Bigfoot tales. Today, a dark secret in the woods gave me chills. Ever felt like something was watching you? Drop your city in the comments and smash that like button to show some love. Now let's begin. The one who stood still, some encounters don't make sense until you feel them in your bones. There are stories that echo louder than gunshots. Stories that never make it into town papers, never spoken aloud in diners over black coffee. But they're real, etched in the quiet between breaths, in the stillness of pine-shaded trails where no birds dare sing. This is one of those stories. In the summer of 1993, deep in the mossy silence of Washington's backcountry, a 61-year-old man named Brooke stood 10 feet away from something the world says doesn't exist. She was taller than any man, blanketed in dark fur, her eyes deep and mournful, like someone who knew the ache of loss. She didn't snarl. She didn't run. She simply stood there, watching him. Then she left behind a gift. Brooke never spoke of her while he lived. Not to the townsfolk, not to the forest rangers, not even in the pages of his hunting journal. Except once. One single entry, scribbled with a shaky hand, left behind for someone to find long after he was gone. This isn't a tale of monsters. This is a story about grief, about stillness, about the kind of silence that doesn't demand answers, only your attention. And it all began the day the forest went quiet. The first time I saw her, I'd just buried Jasper. I don't mean that in a poetic way. I mean it exactly. The ground was still soft where I laid him, just down the slope from the back of the cabin. 12 years with that dog, and when I folded his old flannel blanket over him, I could still smell the river on his coat. Pine needles, gunpowder, and something warm like copper. I remember staring at that mound of earth and feeling the forest press in. Not hostile, just still. The stillness started then. Not in the air or the trees, but in me. Something closed. A door, maybe, or a breath held too long. That cabin, my cabin, sat miles off the service road, far enough that I could go 3 weeks without seeing another man's face. I built it in '81 with reclaimed lumber and a stubborn need to disappear. Folks in town knew me as Brooke from the Ridge, the quiet guy who bought canned beans in bulk and never lingered long at the register. They didn't know about the silence. They didn't know that sometimes, at night, the trees would lean in like they were listening, or mourning. I didn't hear birds for weeks after Jasper died. No crows, no nuthatches. Just the wind whispering low through the high branches. And sometimes, God help me, I thought I heard breathing. Not mine, not any humans. It wasn't madness. I know what loneliness sounds like. This was different. It began small. Deer tracks where no deer should tread. A half-gnawed rabbit carcass, left untouched by scavengers. The sharp scent of wet bark, like something peeled alive. Once, I found moss, peeled clean off the north side of every tree in a 20-foot radius. Perfect, deliberate, and I should have walked away. A sane man would have. But something deeper than sanity kept me there. Maybe grief, maybe guilt. Maybe that part of us that still believes in ghosts even after the war, even after love, even after everything. One morning in late June, I packed a light bag, slung my Winchester over one shoulder, and headed northwest into a part of the forest I hadn't touched in years. I didn't know what I was looking for. Maybe I wanted to get lost on purpose. Maybe I wanted something to find me. It was the third day in, somewhere past where the map curled and faded, when I smelled it, like soil and blood and old cedar smoke, sharp enough to sting, then gone. I stopped dead, finger on the trigger. The sun hadn't yet broken through the morning mist, and the trees were breathing. Slow, deep, as if the forest itself was waiting. And that night, though I heard it, I hadn't lit a fire, just sat near a cold ring of stones with my jacket pulled tight, and my ears sharpened to every twig snap. Around midnight, the ground shifted. Soft, deliberate steps. Not crashing like a bear, not sniffing like a cougar. No, this was different. I didn't sleep. Come dawn, light filtered in like milk through gauze. And that's when I saw her. 7, maybe 8 feet tall, broad as a doorway, coated in coarse black hair that glistened with dew. She didn't move, didn't growl, didn't blink, just stood at the tree line, half shadow, half sunlight. But it was the eyes that held me. Dark, thoughtful, aware. Not animal, not human. Something out looked back at me like she knew what I'd lost. I didn't lift my rifle. I couldn't. My arms felt like iron bars, and even if I could move, I didn't want to. She wasn't a threat. She was observing. Then she turned and vanished into the woods without a sound. No crackling leaves, no parting branches. Just gone. I sat there a long time. When I finally stood, I found something near my boots, a bundle of herbs, tied in dried grass, and a single feather, long, gray striped. I hadn't heard her place it. But there it was. I didn't tell anyone. Not that day. Not for years. Some things lose their meaning when spoken aloud. But I knew, right then, that the forest wasn't empty, that it never had been, and I wasn't alone anymore. What I didn't know, standing there with that feather in my hand, and the sun climbing lazy through the fog, was that this was just the beginning. That grief, when deep enough, carves a channel straight into another world. And sometimes, something reaches back. But I would learn. I would learn. It didn't happen all at once. The forest doesn't scream when it changes, it just gets quiet. So quiet, you don't even notice it until one morning. You realize you haven't heard birdsong in days. Not a chirp, not a rustle. Just wind, low and steady, like it's holding something back. After that morning, I saw her. The quiet thickened. At first, I thought maybe it was me. Grief pulling the world inward, muting things. But this was different. Even Jasper, when he was alive, would known. The kind of quiet that makes prey freeze, not just hide. I started walking longer trails, not to hunt, not even to think, just to feel. I followed dry creek beds, circled old elk trails, let the hills pull me deeper than I'd meant to go. I kept hoping to find that feather again, or her. Anything to prove that moment hadn't been something my mind conjured to keep me from falling apart. That was when the forest began to behave differently. I remember the first time I noticed the birds weren't just quiet. They were gone. Whole stretches of forest fell abandoned. No squirrels, no insects, not even deer scat. The air smelled thick, damp, like something had spoiled under the leaves. Then came the moss. I walked through a stretch of red cedar one afternoon and saw that the moss, thick and curling and usually scattered, had been stripped, only on the north sides. Every trunk, as if someone or something had peeled it off with methodical care. I ran my fingers along the bark, damp and exposed like skin just beneath a scab. That's when I started sleeping with my rifle closer to my bedroll. And keeping track, obsessively, what should be moving and what wasn't. One evening near dusk, I watched a raccoon bolt across a clearing like it was on fire. It didn't stop to sniff, didn't look around, just ran, straight line. No hesitation. I didn't follow. I stood there, back straight, heart thudding, staring at the place it came from. Just trees and shadows, but something about the darkness felt denser than it should been. Like it was watching me back. That's when I knew I wasn't alone. I didn't sleep that night either. I sat on the cabin porch, listening to nothing. And when you're out there long enough, nothing becomes its own kind of noise. A heavy, deliberate silence that feels like breath against the back of your neck. There was one night, still vivid, like it happened yesterday. I was near the East Ridge, setting a line of squirrel traps. I crouched behind a fallen log and looked up to see nothing. Just trees, but the hairs on my arms stood up before I even knew why. Then I saw them. Footprints, not boots. Not paws, bare, wide, toes spread, deep enough to hold a few ounces of pooled rain. That was when I started marking spots. I carved initials into trees, notches along trail markers. If I came back and the marks had changed, I'd know something was out there with intention. But they never changed. Not at first. They vanished. 3 notches I carved near hemlock bend disappeared in a week. Tree looked untouched, like it had healed over. I tested it again with something harder to erase. I left a strip of my old tarp tied in a branch fork. 3 days later, it was hanging back on my cabin doorknob. And that was the moment. The one that split the whole thing wide open, because it meant whatever was out there knew where I lived. I'd like to say I stayed calm. I didn't. I locked the door, cocked the Winchester, and waited until dawn with the lights off. Heart thudding like I was back in the jungles of Nam, watching shadows twitch with every damn leaf that moved. But dawn came, and nothing happened. It should have ended there. That should have been enough to pack a bag, walk out of those woods, and never look back. But I didn't leave, not yet, because something about it didn't feel like a threat. It felt curious, measured, like someone knocking gently on your door, not trying to break it down. And maybe I was tired of being alone. A week later, I returned to the same ridge, same bend, same trees. Nothing unusual, but I stepped over the old fire ring from last summer. I saw something half buried under the ash. A claw. Long. Black. Almost fossilized. But smooth like it had been carried, not shed. I held it in my palm for a long time, not shed, turned it over. Waited, studied it. Then I buried it again, right where I found it. I didn't want to keep it. I just needed to know it was real. Hook. But then I did something stupid. I left a note, scrawled on the back of a ration label. I wrote, "I saw you." I don't mean harm. I folded it and tucked it into the crack of a cedar trunk near the footprint trail. 3 days later, it was gone. And in its place was a stone, flat, round, warm somehow, despite the morning chill. That's when I knew. She'd read it, and the silence in the trees, it wasn't emptiness. It was listening. She came just after the fire went out. It was the 3rd night into the forest, deeper than I'd ever let myself go since Jasper passed. I'd followed the scent again, earthy, pungent, like wet bark steeped in time and old sorrow. It pulled at something primal in me, like memory laced with instinct. I hadn't lit a fire that evening, not fully. Just a smolder in the coals, enough for warmth but not enough for light. I wanted to feel what was around me, unfiltered, no crackling distraction, no man-made comfort. Just dark, cool air, and that deep forest silence I was beginning to understand not as emptiness, but anticipation. My tent was no more than a tarp hung against a downed log, my rifle within reach, my boots tucked neatly near my head. I was half asleep when the forest changed. It wasn't a sound. It was the absence of one. The frogs stopped first, then the crickets. Even the wind, which had hummed all evening through the firs, stilled like a held breath. And then I heard it. Soft. Measured. Weight behind each step. Heavy but not clumsy. Like something big was moving but didn't want to be noticed. I held my breath, hand on the stock of the Winchester, unsure whether to move or vanish into the ground. Seconds passed. Maybe a minute. My skin prickled. Every instinct screamed predator. But I didn't run. I didn't even flinch. And then she stepped into view. She didn't walk into camp. She stood just beyond it, right where the forest thinned and moonlight broke through the canopy in broken silver shards. The light caught her hair first. Dark, long, tangled with bits of moss and twig. Not fur. Not exact. Not the way people describe. It draped over her like a coarse shawl, matting at the joints and shoulders. She was tall. Taller than any man I'd seen. Her shoulders broad, torso thick, legs like tree trunks, but it was her stillness that paralyzed me. She didn't move, not a twitch, just stood there, watching. I couldn't see her eyes at first. The shadows masked most of her face, but the shape of her body, female. I could tell by the curve of the hips, the slight slope of her chest, was unmistakable. I sat up slowly. Didn't speak, didn't move the rifle. Just looked back at her. The wind shifted, and I smelled it again. That same scent, bark and stone and something old. Not rot, no danger. Something deeper, like time had left her behind. She tilted her head slightly, and the moon caught her face for just a second, and I saw them. Her eyes, dark, human, tired, like someone who'd been holding on too long to a pain no one else could carry. That was the moment the fear cracked, and something else came rushing in. Not awe, not wonder, but something heavier. Recognition. She took one slow step forward. My fingers twitched against the stock. Reflex. But I didn't raise it. I couldn't. Her gaze didn't challenge me. It didn't beg. It simply was. Present, like the trees, like the silence. She stopped again, right at the edge of the fire ring. We were no more than 15 feet apart, close enough to see the breath rise from her mouth, slow and steady, like smoke off wet stone. I didn't know whether to speak. My mouth was dry. My heart beat, loud enough I wondered if she could hear it. Then she turned. One smooth, weightless motion. Not a rustle. Not a break. Just vanished into the tree line as if she'd been absorbed. I stayed there until morning, staring. And when the light finally filtered through the trees, I found it. A bundle, right beside my boots. Herbs, twisted together with grass, bound in a way I'd never seen before. Delicate but intentional, and tucked into the folds. A feather, long, gray, barred like a hawk's. It was clean, dry, almost placed like an offering. That was when I sat down, not from fear, from something else. Grief, maybe, or awe. I don't know, but I felt like someone had just answered a question I hadn't dared ask out loud. And here's the thing. The hook I never saw coming. The moment I should have understood everything was about to change. I didn't tell anyone, not because I didn't think they'd believe me, but because something inside me whispered not to. Like speaking her into words would erase her. Like she only existed in that silence. So I kept it. The feather. The bundle. The moment. I carried them home, wrapped in the same flannel Jasper used to sleep on. Laid them on my cabin shelf beside his collar. And every day, I looked at them and waited for the feeling to fade. It didn't. Instead, it grew. And the forest, my forest, never felt empty again. But what I didn't realize then was that the moment she stepped out of those trees, I hadn't just seen something I couldn't explain. I'd been seen. And there's no going back from that. The bundle stayed on my shelf for weeks. I never touched it again. Never moved it. It sat there between Jasper's collar and my old canteen, like a part of the room had always belonged to her. I stopped looking at it after a while, but I felt it. Like heat off a dying fire, it lingered in the corners of the cabin, in the pauses between creaking floorboards, in the way I poured my coffee slower. The silence hadn't left. It had changed. Now it watched with me. I didn't tell anyone. Not the woman at the general store, not the guy at the post office, not even old Leo from the tavern who once claimed he saw a cougar climb onto a church roof. That silence between us, it grew too heavy for words. Instead, I went back, not right away. I waited until the weight in my chest swelled into something unbearable. Some people call it grief. Some call it loneliness. I don't know what word fits the shape of a man who's seen something sacred and doesn't know what to do with the knowing. So I walked. I followed the same trail, worn just enough for me to remember, but wild enough to pretend I was still getting lost. The air was drier, the moss less slick underfoot. Late July. The trees buzzed with heat. But that spot, her spot, wasn't touched, like time avoided it. This time, I brought something with me. It wasn't much, just a stone Jasper used to carry in his mouth. Smooth, rounded, reddish. He'd found it by the creek when he was barely a year old and treated it like his own pup. I tied it with a strip of fabric from my oldest shirt, the one he used to sleep on when storms rolled through. I didn't write a note. I just placed it where she'd left the bundle, quiet, open, like saying, I remember too. I didn't light a fire that night. I barely breathed. The second night was when she returned. It started the same. Silence folding the forest like a blanket pulled tight. Then the steps, careful, spaced, heavy but familiar now. And then she was there. Different this time. She wasn't standing back in the trees. She stepped into the clearing like she had every right to be there. She was closer. The moon caught her side. Broad shoulders. That same thick coat. But there was something else now. A fullness to her shape. A shift in her balance. She was pregnant. Her gait was slower. Measured, not cautious. Deliberate. One hand, large and worn, rested on the swell of her stomach. The other hung loosely at her side. And her face, God, her face. I don't know how to describe it right. It wasn't human, not in the way we measure it. But it wasn't animal either. It held pain, recognition, memory. Like she carried centuries in the lines of her brow. Her eyes met mine again. And this time, they didn't just watch. They searched. And then she saw it. The stone, the little offering wrapped in that piece of shirt. She knelt, not like a beast. Like a woman who understood what it meant to mourn. She picked up the stone slowly, cradled it in her palms, turned it once, twice. Then she pressed it against her chest. Not just her chest, her heart. And then she cried. Not like we do. Not sobbing or shaking, but tears, silent, steady, slipping down the coarse lines of her cheeks like rain. It was the quietest sound I've ever heard. A sound that wasn't a sound at all, just sorrow made visible. I didn't move. I couldn't. I just watched. And maybe that's what she needed. Not a witness, not a friend, just someone to be still with her while she remembered what she lost, or maybe what she hoped to find. Minutes passed, maybe more. Then she stood. She didn't run, didn't hide, just stood there a moment longer, holding that stone against her belly like it was more than a memory, like it was a promise. Then, slowly, she turned and disappeared into the dark, and I stayed there till dawn. Hook! But what struck me most wasn't her tears. It was the way I felt them in my own. It was like the grief wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to both of us. I walked home that day with nothing in my hands, but everything inside me felt rearranged. The forest no longer loomed. It breathed. And for the first time in years, I didn't dread the silence waiting behind my door. But I didn't sleep either. Not really. I'd close my eyes and see her fingers brushing the stone. Hear that silence again, so full it pressed on your lungs like smoke. And for weeks, I kept hearing something just beyond the trees. Not footsteps, not voices. Just as if something out there was remembering me too. And it wasn't done yet. Summer stretched thin by late August. The heat pressed lower, and even the trees seemed to hold their breath, waiting for something to give. I knew she'd return, but not when, not how. And I didn't go back to the forest to chase her. I went because something inside me had started to depend on that silence we shared. It wasn't peace, not exactly. It was something rougher, something earned. And I didn't bring a gift this time. I wasn't sure if I needed to, but she came anyway. It was the third night again. Same ridge, same clearing, same tarp laid low near the old pine root. I sat with my back against a stump, knees drawn up, every joint in my body aching like the forest was pressing into me. No fire, no rifle this time either. I had nothing to offer but presence, and maybe that was all she'd wanted from the start. I heard her before I saw her. That now familiar rhythm. 4 or 5 steps, then a pause. Long enough to feel her deciding. Then the first glimpse of her, emerging from the shadows like she'd been born from them. The moon was lower this time, but the stars were sharp, and they caught the silver threads in her hair. She looked older somehow, or maybe it was the weight she carried. Her belly had rounded. There was no mistaking it now. She stepped closer than before. Not fast, never fast. She walked like someone who'd been burned by running. Her eyes found mine again, and for a few moments, we simply existed in that clearing, surrounded by trees that knew better than to interrupt. Then, without a sound, she knelt. Hook, and that's when I knew. She hadn't come for me. She'd come to say goodbye. She leaned forward, one hand bracing against the ground, the other drawing a single slow shape into the dirt between us. A crude X, nothing more. But the way she carved it, deliberate, deep, made my skin tighten. That symbol didn't feel like a message. It felt like a marking, a memory etched into soil. She looked at me one last time. Her breath fogged faintly in the air. And I swear on Jasper's grave, her eyes weren't just watching. They were mourning something. Maybe herself, maybe the world, maybe what might have been. Then she stood. Her hands lingered over her stomach as she turned, and in one slow motion she vanished into the trees. No noise, no farewell. I didn't follow. I didn't need to. I sat there until morning, staring at that X in the dirt. It wasn't just a shape. It was a seal, a closing, and somehow, a promise. That was the last time I saw her, but it wasn't the last time she saw me. The leaves hadn't turned yet, but you could smell the change. That early crispness in the mornings. The way the sky took on that bruised blue tint before dusk. It was subtle, but I felt it like a hand on my shoulder from someone you hadn't heard sneak up. After that last meeting, after the X in the dirt, I hadn't planned on going back. But something in me twisted loose the longer I stayed away. The clearing pulled at me, not as a memory, but as a pulse. I didn't bring anything this time. Not food, not gifts, not words. I just went. I think I knew, somewhere inside, that it would be the last time, not because I feared something, because the rhythm had shifted. A season was ending. The air along the trail was still, not dead, listening. I reached the clearing just before dusk, the same one where she'd stood, where she'd cried. Everything was where I left it, the soil still faintly etched with that faded X, softened by rain and time. I sat down where I always had, back against that old wide stump. No fire, no light. The dark didn't scare me anymore. Time passed. A bird called once and then fell silent. The moon hadn't risen yet, but there was enough glow from the horizon to make out shapes. And then, like always, she arrived. But this time, she didn't come from the trees. She stepped out from the side I never turned toward, the east edge, where the trees grow thickest and the moss hangs like curtains. She moved slower now, heavier. She was close, closer than she'd ever allowed herself before. And I saw it plain. She was full with child. Her belly was round and taut, her hands supporting it gently as she walked. Her breath came harder, deeper, And for the first time, I saw her shake. Not from fear, but from effort. Hook. And then it hit me. I hadn't given her a gift. I'd given her a name. She stopped 10 feet away. Same distance. But it felt closer. Like that space had been carved open for something sacred. She didn't kneel this time. She stood still, one hand on her stomach, the other dangling at her side. And then she did something I hadn't seen her do before. She smiled. Not wide. Not the way we smile. But her lips shifted. Her jaw softened. And something warm passed across her eyes like a breeze stirring ash. It wasn't joy. It was peace. Then she bent down, slow and deliberate, and with a single finger drew another mark into the soil. Not an X this time. A circle, one clean stroke. And just like that, she turned and vanished into the black pines. No wind followed her, no whisper. Just the echo of her final shape in the dirt. I stared at it until the cold crept up my legs. A circle. Closed. Whole. Unbroken. The wind returned. The stars sharpened. And I realized something I hadn't dared name until that moment. She hadn't just been saying goodbye. She was letting me go. I didn't cry. Not then. Not then. But when I stood and brushed my hand against that circle, I felt it. In the bones. In the breath. In the quiet that followed me home like a friend. And that night, for the first time in years, I dreamed of Jasper. But he wasn't running. He was lying beside something. Tall, shadowed, arms wrapped around her belly. Beneath a tree I didn't recognize. And in that dream, the wind didn't howl. It hummed, like a lullaby for something just born. But I didn't speak of that dream, either. Not yet. Not until the forest spoke again. The year after I last saw her, I returned to the clearing on the same date, same hour, as if the trees ran on some private clock and I was just trying to keep time with it. I didn't know what I expected. Maybe nothing. Maybe silence. Maybe that circle drawn in the dirt now buried beneath a season of fallen leaves. I brought nothing. No rifle. No stone. Just myself. A little older. A little more tired. Unsure if the forest still remembered me. But it did. The clearing was quiet. Not the fearful kind of quiet I'd once known, but a settled hush, like a chapel left open. The air smelled of cold bark and wet moss. And when I stepped into the center, right where she'd drawn the circle, I felt it. The change. The shift. Something had been left. At first I didn't see it, but then the light caught something at the base of the western pine. A ring. Not jewelry. Stones, smooth and warm-colored, arranged in a perfect circle, no wider than a dinner plate. They didn't belong there. I knew this place like I knew the bones in my hand. These stones weren't part of it. They were placed, and in the center, another feather, barred, gray, exactly like the first, but older, weathered, still tucked in place, as if the earth had been asked to hold it gently. I knelt beside it, didn't touch it, just stared. And for the first time, I didn't wonder why. I understood. This was a message, a memory, a keeping. She was gone, but not vanished. And this was her way of saying so. I came back the next year. Same day. Same hour. Another gift waited for me. This time it was a bundle. Berries, neatly gathered and wrapped in birch bark, tied with thin grass. Still fresh, as if just placed. Too fresh. There were no berry bushes for miles, and none still ripe by early fall. But there they were. Red and deep blue, sweet and strange, like they'd been picked just for me. Hook. That was when I realized she was still watching. But she wasn't alone anymore, because near the bundle, just barely pressed into the earth, was a second set of prints. Smaller, not human. Not quite hers either. Toes wide, steps shallow. like something learning to walk. I didn't sleep that night. I sat under the stars in silence, imagining them out there. Mother and child, somewhere beyond the ridge, moving through shadow and branch, their world running parallel to mine, but never quite touching again. And for 3 years, it continued. Year 3, I found a circle of mushrooms, each one bent slightly inward, with a small piece of birch carved into a tiny curl. It wasn't random. It was placed. Just like all the rest, I never brought gifts after that. The exchange wasn't about barter. It was about remembering and being remembered. And each time I returned, I found the clearing unchanged. But I never felt alone. I started seeing the forest differently after that. The rustling in the brush no longer stirred fear, but curiosity. The trees felt like sentinels, old and knowing. Even the wind began to carry more than just weather. It carried her presence, her peace. And every so often, walking those trails, I'd find the impossible. A stick leaning against a tree in a place no man had been. A pile of smooth stones shaped like a path marker. Once, a braid of grass tied around the branch of a birch, too high for me to reach without climbing. They weren't accidents. They were echoes. And I began to understand what she had given me wasn't just a moment. It was an invitation to see the world beneath the world, the rhythm beneath the silence. But I didn't tell anyone. Not yet. Because some stories don't ask to be shared. They ask to be felt. And deep down, I knew. This one wasn't finished. Not yet. The first frost came early that year. Thin, delicate, like the forest had exhaled and forgotten to pull its breath back in. I remember stepping outside the cabin and hearing the crunch of frost on wood, brittle as paper. I wasn't a young man anymore. My knees told me the weather was turning faster than the calendar could keep up. And for the first time since I built that cabin, I didn't go into the woods that fall. I sat instead, and I wrote, not much, just fragments, dates, weather, the way the birds had returned, but only so far. I didn't write about her, not in words anyone would understand. There are some truths that can't be explained, only witnessed. So I left pieces, clues. If someone read slow enough, with the right kind of silence in them, maybe they'd hear it too. I didn't expect anyone to read my journal. It wasn't meant for that, but I kept it anyway, tucked under the floorboard by my bed, between the old ammo box and Jasper's last collar. It felt wrong to burn it, and too heavy to carry. That winter came down hard, snow stacked deep along the eaves. The trees groaned under the weight. Sometimes I thought I heard something outside at night, footsteps maybe, but not near, distant, like someone checking in. I didn't dream as much after that, but one came through clearer than the rest. She was standing on the ridge, child beside her. Not a child like ours, but tall already, lean, covered in that same dark coat. They both looked older. They didn't wave, didn't move, just stood there, watching the cabin. And I woke with the strange certainty that they weren't looking at me. They were saying goodbye. Hook. It wasn't until after I passed that someone found what I left and realized I'd never really been alone in that cabin. My nephew, or maybe his son. I forget who found the journal first, handed it off to someone who knew how to read between the lines. They only ever found the one entry, one that mattered, anyway, short, scratched into the page like I'd written it with my breath running out. She stood still, pregnant. Marked the ground with an X, left something each year. Forgave me, I think, for being a man. That's all. The rest is just the woods, but I like to believe that entry said enough. Said everything, really. About silence. About what it means to witness something without claiming it. To let it be wild, sacred, grieving. I didn't tell the town. Didn't go on radio. Never reported a sighting. I think that's why she came back to me. And in those last days, before my hands got too stiff, before my mind began drifting like fog, I sat out on the porch and listened. not for sounds, for absence. And some nights it felt like she was listening back. So if someone finds that book, if they read this story, don't try to prove it. Don't go searching for her. Just remember, some things are meant to stay wild, and some silences are sacred. She never ran. That's the part I keep circling back to. Not once did she bolt like an animal. Not once did she bare her teeth or vanish in panic. She just stood there, tall, present, watching, as if she knew the rules of fear better than I did, and had chosen, in spite of it all, not to follow them. That moment, her standing still, comes to me now in pieces. Not the whole shape, not her face, but the way the moonlight settled around her like fog folding into skin. The way the trees didn't move, not even in the wind, as if the forest itself had leaned in to listen. She wasn't a creature of escape. She was a presence, rooted like grief, like truth. And now, years later, when I walk the edges of those same woods, or what's left of them, I find myself listening not for her return, but for the part of me that stayed behind in that clearing. The man I was before I met her. The man who thought silence meant nothingness, who mistook stillness for absence. But that silence, it meant everything. I've heard the stories since, online forums, podcasts, campfire whispers passed down from one tight-lipped witness to another. Most folks describe rage, screams in the dark, twisted branches, claw marks, blood. They want the beast. They need the monster, because that makes the world simple. A clean line between us and them, between what we know and what we fear. But that's not what I saw. I saw sorrow. I saw sorrow. I saw intention. I saw someone, something, who mourned like I did, who grieved with the quiet reverence of a widow tracing the air where a name used to be. Hook. And now I wonder, what if we're the loud ones? What if we're the ghosts? I used to think she found me, that I was the one being watched. But now, I'm not so sure. Maybe I stepped into something ancient. Maybe I trespassed into a grief that wasn't mine. A sorrow older than cabins or rifles or names. Maybe I was the one being forgiven, because she never tried to hurt me, never threatened, never chased. All she did was stand. Still, calm, marked by time. And let me see her, really see her. And somehow that changed everything. I've stopped needing answers. I don't need photos or casts of prints or hairs in a Ziploc bag to believe. That night, her eyes told me more about the universe than any preacher or professor ever could. That we are not alone. Not the way we think. That some silences aren't empty. They're sacred. That not all stories are meant to end with closure. Some are meant to echo. And so I leave you with this. If you find yourself in a forest that feels too quiet, where even the wind forgets how to move, don't speak. Don't run. Don't reach for your flashlight. Just wait. Stand still. She might be there, watching. And if you're lucky, she'll let you leave with your silence intact. Some stories do not end. They simply settle, like mist between old trees, or like breath held long after the world has gone quiet. We follow them not to find answers, but to remember what it means to wonder. And somewhere, deep inside that wondering, is where truth lives. Not loud or proud, but soft, slow, and still. There's something ancient in the way silence moves through the forest. Not the silence of emptiness, but of presence. A stillness that doesn't shout for attention, but waits patiently for someone quiet enough to notice. That is where the sacred hides. Not in light, but in shadow. Not in certainty, but in the spaces between. The wilderness doesn't owe us revelation. Nature isn't required to explain itself. Yet, now and then, in those brief and aching moments, it does. Not through language, but through gesture. through pause, through the eyes of something that sees us, really sees us, and chooses not to turn away. There are truths that live beyond logic, realness that resists measurement, a kind of knowing that hums not in the brain, but in the bones. Call it myth, call it myth, call it memory, call it madness, but whatever it is, it's ours to carry gently. To respect, not to claim, to feel, not to own. Because not every mystery is meant to be solved. Some are meant to be held, quietly, like a breath you don't want to break. Like a shadow at the edge of a dream, like a story that once heard changes the shape of your silence forever. And perhaps the greatest lesson in all of this, hidden under leaves, tucked behind old bark, whispered in a single print in the soil, is this, that the unknown does not always wish to be feared. Sometimes it just wishes to be remembered. Thank you for walking with us tonight. Through the hush, through the dark, through the space where stories refuse to die. If this story stirred something in you, if it made you pause, wonder, or recall something half forgotten in your own life, we'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever encountered something you couldn't explain? Something that stayed with you long after? And if you'd like to journey with us again into more stories like this, where truth and mystery entwine, make sure to subscribe, follow, and turn on your notifications. There are still many stories waiting in the trees. Somewhere out there, something is listening.